I want to start this morning by talking about praise. About a month ago, we talked about praise and what it means to praise God. And we gave the analogy or the story of when you go to a restaurant that you love, you see a movie, hear a song, or just when you're with the one you love and you speak words of sharing with others the goodness, the things that you're enjoying. That's praise. Hey, I ate at this restaurant and it was wonderful. That's praise of the restaurant. Or, thank you. You were so kind in your actions of doing this for me or serving me in that way. Praising your spouse or a friend. It's you've enjoyed it. It was beautiful. And you make a note of it. It was so great, so right that you share it. That's what praise is, and that's what praise of God should be. When we acknowledge Him, acknowledge His actions, His character, and it's an expression of joy and a rejoicing and of happiness. And so I want that to be the background because today, the whole message, our whole passage is about praise. It's about the praise of God. Where we are in our study of Revelation, we have looked at the judgment of the harlot, the great city Babylon, which started in chapter 17. We saw that the harlot is presented as a worldwide organized false religion that exists throughout the beast's empire, and we identified it tentatively as Islam as far as the best of our world conditions presently will suggest. And she has great wealth and extravagance in her description that shows that she is successful among the people, and she is reproducing throughout the whole world. She's the mother of harlots and abominations. And she is also described as hostile to the saints, which are witnesses of Jesus, and thus she's actually putting them to death, to cancel, to remove any witness of Christ and of God. She's also described as, in relation to the beast, as riding on the beast. The beast had 7 heads, which we saw were the 7 world empires. The one that is, where John is speaking, is Rome, and the one to come is the Antichrist empire. She is dwelling amidst amidst the last empire, at least, the Antichrist empire. That empire has 10 horns as well, which is the 10 nations that politically and militarily unite with the Antichrist. And then last week we saw the description of the relationship of the beast and the harlot, where the beast and the 10 horns hate and destroy the harlot. And God uses them as an instrument of judgment against her. And then chapter 18 began a more in-depth description of her destruction and the reactions to it. The first pronouncement was of her fall, the surety of her fall that came from the mighty angel, and then a call from the throne for God's people to leave her so they won't be caught up in her plagues nor in the wrath that God is about to unleash onto that city. Then there was a series of reactions. We saw reactions of mourning and lament from kings, nations that have united with her, merchants, and sea travelers, or anyone that got in business from the sea, because they were all dependent on her for their wealth and for their power and their security. They looked upon her as being truth and finding their purpose and reason, and they worshipped through her falsely, a false god. They didn't mourn for her or the thousands of souls that were lost, destroyed in her, but how her doom would affect them. This morning, in great contrast to that lament on earth, our text records heaven's reaction to the judgment of the great harlot in chapter 18, verse 20 through chapter 19, verse 5. We're going to see 3 reactions to the judgments of the great harlot from heaven. Now, structurally, we're still in that interlude before the second coming of Christ. It's after the 7 bowls. The text is broken off, and we're seeing the fall of Babylon. We're still in that section where the Babylon's fall is being described. Rather, in this section, it's going to be how heaven reacts to that description and to those events. And after verse 5, it's a transition, starting in 19:6, is a transition over into the second coming. So that's what we'll get to next week. But for this week, we'll conclude this section specifically about the fall of Babylon. So let's look at the first reaction from heaven, which is the call to rejoice. Chapter 18, verse 20. The text says, "Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her." Now look, the first thing it says is to rejoice. That's a command. It's not a suggestion, not a multiple choice. It's a command. Rejoice. And it's a present command, present tense, which means it's continual. This is something that we should rejoice continually over. And rejoice has the idea of to be continually glad, to celebrate, to delight. And we're to delight over her, over the harlot, that she is defeated, that she is judged. First, it addresses, O heaven. That's the first and primary subject, which is those who are in heaven, the angelic creatures and other living creatures. It's interesting that angels do look forward towards the end, where all of sin will be judged, and the defeat of Satan's kingdom, and the restoration of creation, because they're at battle, at war, until that time comes, as well as humans. But this would also include, as it continues, and you saints, apostles, and prophets. Also, it's all the humans, God's people who are in heaven, who are saved. They also rejoice, because this is another step. The saints, apostles, prophets, that encompasses all of God's people who are in heaven. It would include those who are on earth, but this is primarily focused on those who are in heaven. And it's interesting that it mentions saints, which literally just means holy ones that are separated out for God's purpose, which includes every believer. Every believer is a saint in God. It's not because of what you've done, but because of what He's done to you. He has made you holy and set you apart. But He also includes the apostles and prophets. And it's very similar to the wording in Ephesians, where it says, Ephesians 2:19 and 20, "So then you," referring to the Gentile believers, "are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the Jewish saints, and are of God's household, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets." Christ Jesus Himself being the cornerstone. What that passage is saying, how it parallels what Revelation is saying, is that the church is built on the message, the foundation of Christ, the gospel, which is presented and preached by the apostles and prophets of the New Testament. That is the message, the foundation, and then the saints are coming in and being built on top of that foundation into a beautiful temple of God's people and God's dwelling for God's glory. Just like in the Old Testament, where there was a physical temple that physically represented God's glory. When you went there, you smelled beautiful smells. It was beautiful marble, beautiful gold, beautiful songs, everything. One ancient writer, Josephus, actually says that when the sun was in a certain spot, it would glisten against the gold and the marble, and it would be hard to see. You would have to cover your eyes. It was so glorious. That's what we're supposed to be. That's the church. The church now is supposed to be that beautiful temple in which God dwells, in which people see the glory of God, the beauty of God. And the reason for rejoicing, the reason is that God has judged the harlots, Babylon's crimes against His people. The same description is used in Jeremiah 51 of Babylon, where heaven and earth is also called to rejoice. And if you remember from last week we continually saw that in Jeremiah, all the descriptions of Babylon, the empire's destruction, are echoed here because they're using the same terminology of Babylon, because that earlier Babylon and then the earlier Tower of Babel are types of this harlot, Babylon, the great city who is falling. So here we see that continuation of that repetition in Jeremiah 51:48, calling everyone to rejoice over her judgment. Now, when the text is calling them to rejoice, it's not to rejoice over the damnation of sinners. or their death. Because God does not rejoice or find delight in the death of sinners. But it's because of the triumph of righteousness and the elimination of his enemies. It's that God will not let evil reign forever. It's rejoicing because God is now taking action, vindicating his people and manifesting his justice upon unpunished sin. So it is one step closer toward the removal of all sin and thus the establishment of his kingdom on earth, which will be filled with no sin, but peace and perfection and glory. And that is worthy of rejoicing, of continual rejoicing, because that can't come until sin is removed and sin is dealt with and sin is punished. And God has given much time, much patience for people to repent and to turn. The second reaction is a pronouncement of the nature of her destruction. Verse 21 through 24. Now, the first reaction proclaimed that God made a judgment against her. In this pronouncement, it's a prophetic act from a powerful angel that explains the nature of that judgment. Verse 21 says, "Then a strong angel took a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, 'So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will not be found any longer.'" So this angel, John is seeing this prophetic act of an angel picking up a stone like a millstone. The word there for millstone, it's not a handheld grinder or stone grinder like this. It refers to a stone like this. It's one that usually it takes an animal or multiple people to turn because it is usually 4 to 5 feet in diameter, 1 foot thick, and weighs thousands of pounds. And the text says it's something like it. So it's a huge stone that is thousands of pounds. And if you threw something like that into the sea, is it coming back up? No. That's the point. It's not coming back up. This image, to a smaller or lesser degree, is also found in Jeremiah 51, verse 61 through 64, where the pronouncement against Babylon is read out loud. That scroll is wound up, and a stone is tied to it, and it's thrown into the Euphrates River, saying that this is going to happen. And just like that stone in the scroll sunk to the bottom, never to rise up again, that prophetic image in Jeremiah 51, the text says, just like that stone, Babylon will not rise again. So here, it's even a bigger stone. It emphasizes the permanence. This Babylon will never rise again. It says, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence. That word for violence there is an event involving sudden force or violence. So it goes parallel, corresponds to the description earlier that its destruction is sudden, and is with fire. It corresponds to the idea that it's possible to have some kind of explosion or fire occurring from the beast and the 10 horns in a single day. And then the angel continues to describe the degree of her destruction. And the angel uses 5 categories. And now he switches over and his speech directly speaks to Babylon herself. Here it's in the third person, now becomes into the second person. So let's look at those. The first category, it says, "And the sound of harpists and musicians and flute players and trumpets will not be heard in you any longer." This refers to music. All music is over. Music is the expressions of emotions of life. Different instruments, different songs, different methods communicate rejoicing, reverence, mourning, so on and so forth. It's the celebration of emotions of life. And the text says, when it says they will not be heard in you any longer. In Greek, that's a double negative. It says they will never be heard. That aspect of life is over. Second category is craftsmen. It says, and no craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer. A craftsman is an artisan, a designer, and it focuses on buildings and creating things of beauty, of usefulness, and enjoyment. They will never be made again in you. The third category speaks of mills, of food. It says, and the sound of a mill will not be heard in you any longer. This is a different word for the millstone, and it can refer to either the handheld or it can refer to the big one. But either way, it's used to grind up grains, and in some cases, olives, to make olive oil or an olive paste. What it's focusing on is these are daily staples of food. And it's work that's done during the day, and you can hear the grinding of the stone. And that aspect of daily life will never be heard again. In contrast to the work and the sounds that are done during the day, he switches over to the fourth category, which is lamps at nighttime. And the light of the lamp will not shine in you any longer. These refer to house lamps that are lit at night to have light to live and to move around when it's dark. And then the fifth category is voice. And it says, and the voice of the bridegroom and the bride will not be heard in you any longer. Now, the voice of the bridegroom and the bride, that is a proverbial reference to the greatest joy known and gladness in life. And so joy itself will not be found in Babylon. So in these 5 categories, we see the normal activities of life. These are images of everyday life that we all enjoy and take for granted. These are the good things of life. They show God's graciousness to us. They're gone. After experiencing God's wrath and judgment, there is no grace of God there, and thus there's no life. Because without God, there is no life. There's only death. So then the angel recaps the reason for her destruction. He first says, for your merchants were the great men of the earth, because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. So their merchants, their businessmen, were great men of the earth. They had power, they had influence. They were powerful men. And they became so because of the deception and the control over the people, like sorcery that she had. The word for sorcery there is pharmakia, where we get pharmacy from. Like they're on drugs, they were so addicted and under her spell. It's a metaphor that she is casting a spell of deception on them. And the second reason in verse 24 says, and in her was found the blood of the prophets and of the saints and of all who have been slain on the earth. Second reason, or second aspect of her crimes, first is deception. Second one is death of murder. And it says the saints and the prophets. Now, who are the prophets? Now, they could either refer to additional end-time prophets God sends to Babylon, or in their violent reaction to the saints who bear witness to Christ and proclaim the proclamation, the words of the prophets of God, it can be their rejection and hostility of the gospel that brings such guilt, or as much as guilt, as if the prophets themselves spoke. And they stand with those other nations who have rejected and killed the prophets. This aspect of them being guilty of more, of even the prophets, it very well could be parallel to what Jesus said in Matthew 23:34, where Jesus is speaking to Jerusalem. He says, therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Now, Jesus is speaking specifically to Jerusalem there. And remember, Abel, that's Cain and Abel. That's from the beginning of time. Jerusalem wasn't even a city at that time. And yet he's saying all the blood is on them because they've rejected God's people, his prophets, his witnesses there at that current time. And that could be what it's being referred to in Revelation. Or it could be specifically the end-time prophets. The point is that the witness of Christ sent to Babylon, sent to the harlot, has been rejected, has been hated, and has been killed. Then notice at the end of 24, it goes beyond just God's people. But it says, and all who have been slain on the earth. So these are other people besides the saints. Babylon is known for her violence. And thus it's fitting that she falls violently. Presumably, all those who she slays are those who do not fall under her spell, who do not accept her and turn over into her religion. To the religion, if it's Islam, then if they don't become Muslims, they are slain. And so that's the pronouncement of the nature of her destruction. It's a judgment that's proclaimed is one of permanent destruction of life because God's grace has been lifted, has been taken away, has been removed from her.